Briarwood, Tennessee was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone else. Nestled between the quiet woods and winding country roads, it felt like a place where time slowed down, and the weight of secrets could hang in the air, unnoticed by most. But the residents of Briarwood would soon learn that some secrets were too heavy to remain hidden forever. Lila Harrington had always known she was meant for something more. She had spent her entire life being the star, captivating attention wherever she went, whether it was in the classroom, at parties, or in the quiet corners of Briarwood's few public spaces. Her striking beauty was matched only by her ambition, and Lila never let anyone forget that. The eldest of the Harrington sisters, she took her position as the family's shining example seriously. But beneath her perfect exterior, there was a lingering emptiness, an anxiety that constantly whispered in her ear, "Am I enough?" Her younger sister, Clara, had always been content to linger in the background, her soft-spoken demeanor overshadowed by Lila's vibrant presence. Clara had never minded, or so she told herself. She found comfort in her quiet life, painting, reading, losing herself in the melodies of her guitar. But lately, something inside her was shifting. The longing for attention, for validation, had started to grow in her chest, silent but powerful. She wanted to be seen. But most of all, she wanted to be loved. It was in this delicate balance of tension that Ethan Rhodes arrived in Briarwood. The town had been buzzing with excitement for days after the news broke that the handsome, mysterious man had taken over the Rhodes Automotive Repair, the town's struggling mechanic shop. At 30, Ethan was 2 years older than Lila and Clara, and yet, he had an air of someone far beyond his years, a man whose past was as enigmatic as his eyes, which seemed to see right through people. The first time Lila laid eyes on Ethan was in the small, weathered Maddie's Grill, the only place in town where the locals gathered for coffee and gossip. It was an ordinary morning, with the sun still lazily creeping over the hills, when her car broke down right in front of the diner. Frustration clouded her face as she opened the hood, cursing under her breath. She didn't know much about cars, and the helplessness she felt was foreign to her. As she stood there, hands on her hips, Ethan appeared, as if summoned by fate itself. He was seated inside, enjoying a solitary breakfast, when his sharp eyes caught sight of the commotion. Without hesitation, he wiped his hands on a napkin and stepped outside. His presence was immediate, commanding, a quiet confidence that filled the space between them. Lila felt an unfamiliar flutter in her stomach, but she quickly pushed it down. This was just another man, another conquest. She'd charmed countless men before, and this one would be no different. But as Ethan approached, everything changed. His steady gaze met hers, and there was something about it, something that made her stomach flip and her pulse quicken. His smile was small, but it was genuine, his voice calm and soothing as he spoke. "Looks like you've got a problem under the hood." Lila swallowed hard, trying to mask her sudden unease. "I didn't know it would be so complicated," she replied, her usual confidence wavering for the first time in a long while. Ethan's laugh was soft, warm, and entirely unforced. "Nothing too bad. I'll have it fixed in no time." As he worked, Lila couldn't help but watch him. There was something mesmerizing about the way his hands moved, precise and sure, as if he had been born with the knowledge of how to fix everything. She found herself leaning in, drawn to him in a way she didn't fully understand. The conversation flowed easily between them, books, cars, dreams. Lila was used to being the one who dominated a conversation, but with Ethan, it felt different. She was listening, really listening, and it felt good. When the car was fixed, and he closed the hood with a satisfying click, Lila impulsively invited him for coffee. "To thank you," she said, though the words sounded hollow in her mouth. What was she really thanking him for? Her heart was racing, and she could barely catch her breath. Ethan's smile widened, and without missing a beat, he accepted. "I'd like that." As they sat across from each other, sipping coffee and talking about their lives, Lila's mind was racing. She had never felt this kind of connection with anyone before, not the quick thrills of flirtation, but something deeper, something unexpected. But what did it mean? Could it be that for once, she wasn't the one in control? She quickly dismissed the thought. After all, Ethan Rhodes was just another man. Yet, as the conversation stretched late into the evening, something in Lila shifted. Little did she know, this seemingly chance encounter would set off a chain of events that would irrevocably change not only her life but Clara's as well. And the shadows of envy and betrayal, so deeply buried within the Harrington family, would soon begin to surface. As she drove home that night, her mind buzzed with the possibilities, but the gnawing feeling remained. Was this man truly just another conquest, or was he something far more dangerous? The days following that chance encounter at Maddie's grill were a blur for Lila. She couldn't shake the image of Ethan's steady hands as he worked on her car, or the way he had listened to her, truly listened, in a way no one ever had before. She had been drawn to many men in the past, but there was something about Ethan that felt different, something deeper, something real. Yet, it wasn't just Ethan who lingered in her mind. Clara, her quiet, introverted sister, had been watching from the sidelines, her eyes sharp and calculating. Lila knew Clara had always admired her, even envied her in many ways, but it wasn't until that night, when Lila rushed into their shared apartment, her eyes sparkling with excitement, that she realized just how much her sister might be affected by Ethan. Clara was sitting cross-legged on the couch, sketching something in her notebook, her usual peaceful expression on her face. When Lila burst in, however, Clara's gaze flicked up in surprise, noting the exuberance in her sister's demeanor. Lila couldn't contain herself. "You won't believe it," she said, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I met him today, the guy I've been telling you about. Ethan Rhodes. He fixed my car. He's perfect, Clara. He's just different. There's something about him." Clara's eyes softened as she put her pencil down. She had always been supportive of Lila, watching from the sidelines as her sister took the spotlight. But this time, the mix of emotions that flickered in Clara's eyes didn't go unnoticed. Lila didn't realize it then, but there was something beneath Clara's calm exterior, something dark and uncomfortable. "I'm happy for you," Clara replied, her voice soft, almost too soft. "He sounds great." Lila's excitement seemed to grow by the second as she recounted every detail of their encounter. From the way Ethan's hands worked over the engine to the way he smiled when they spoke. "We talked for hours, Clara. I've never connected with anyone like that before. He's everything I want. And I think he feels the same." Clara's heart clenched. She wanted to be happy for her sister, of course. But there was a small voice inside her, whispering that she, too, wanted to be the one to experience that connection. She had watched Lila bask in the glow of attention her entire life, but now, Clara felt an unfamiliar sensation stirring within her, a longing, a jealousy that she had never allowed herself to acknowledge. A sly smile crept across Lila's face as she finished telling her story. She leaned in closer to Clara, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You know, I've been thinking. Why don't we have some fun with this? We could switch places, just for a little while. See if he can tell the difference between us. It'll be just like old times, remember? When we'd play games and trick everyone. It could be fun, Clara. We could both have him." Clara's breath caught in her throat. A part of her was repelled by the idea, disgusted even. But another part, a part she hadn't known existed, was intrigued. She had always lived in Lila's shadow, had always been the quiet one, the one who never demanded attention. The thought of being someone else, of stepping into Lila's shoes, of being desired in the way that Lila was, made her heart race. She hesitated, the weight of the decision heavy in the air between them. But Lila's enthusiasm was infectious, and Clara found herself nodding slowly. "Okay," she said, the words tasting bitter on her tongue. "Let's do it." Over the next few days, the twins worked tirelessly, preparing for the deception that would consume them both. They practiced each other's mannerisms, their walks, their laughs. Lila, ever the perfectionist, taught Clara how to mimic her confident stride, how to talk just like her, how to laugh the same way. They swapped clothes, Lila's bold, eye-catching outfits and Clara's quieter, more subdued choices, so that they could pass for each other convincingly. They made sure every detail was perfect, down to the smallest nuances of their expressions and tone of voice. At first, the game felt light-hearted, fun even. It was a chance to experience something new, something different. But as the days passed, Lila and Clara began to fall into a rhythm, a dangerous one. Clara began to notice how Ethan's eyes would linger a little longer on her when she was Lila. How his smile would widen, his voice softening when he looked at her. It wasn't just a game anymore, at least not for Clara. But for Lila, it was about control. It was about proving that she could be anyone she wanted to be, even if it meant pretending to be her sister. She watched with a mix of possessiveness and pride as Clara played her role. Lila told herself that it was just a game, that everything would go back to normal once they were done. But deep down, a nagging fear began to creep in, fear that Clara might not want to let go of the game, or worse, that Ethan might start seeing Clara instead of her. Their debriefing sessions, once filled with excitement and shared laughter, grew tense. Lila started asking questions she had never asked before, testing Clara's reactions, making sure they were both still on the same page. She would recount the smallest details of each date, watching Clara closely for signs of any jealousy, any slip-ups. And Clara started to feel the weight of it all. The lines between what was real and what was fake began to blur, and she found herself longing for something more from Ethan. It wasn't just a game anymore. It was becoming something else entirely, a dangerous obsession that neither twin had anticipated. As the days turned into weeks, the excitement that had once fueled the game began to morph into something darker, something more consuming. Each sister began to compete in subtle, unseen ways, each one desperate to create a stronger connection with Ethan. And as their rivalry deepened, the bond between them, once unbreakable, started to crack under the pressure. Neither of them realized how far they had gone, how dangerous the game had become. What had started as a harmless diversion was now a ticking time bomb, and no one, not even the sisters themselves, could predict how it would end. The game had started innocently enough, but now, it was spiraling out of control. What had once been a light-hearted challenge between sisters had morphed into an obsession, one that neither Lila nor Clara fully understood. Their lives were now intricately tied to Ethan Rhodes, the man who had no idea that he was dating both sisters, each one pretending to be the other. Lila had always been the dominant one, the leader, the one who took charge in every situation. But as the weeks passed, the lines between them blurred, and she felt a deep, gnawing unease. Clara, her quiet, introspective sister, had begun to excel in the game. Her subtlety, her gentleness, traits that Lila had always dismissed, had become her secret weapon. Ethan, though still clearly drawn to Lila, seemed to find something incredibly alluring in Clara's softer, more vulnerable persona. Lila had always controlled the narrative, always been the one to pull the strings. But now, the fear was creeping in. What if Clara, the one who had always stood in the background, took this from her? What if Clara became the one Ethan truly wanted? The thought was suffocating, like a tight grip around Lila's chest. It was one evening in late summer, when the air was thick with humidity, that the tension finally snapped. The twins had spent the day preparing for their next date with Ethan. Lila had insisted on wearing a bold red dress, her trademark confidence radiating as she checked herself in the mirror. Clara, as usual, was content to play the quieter role, her simple yet elegant attire a far cry from her sister's. But there was a look in her eyes tonight, something different. Clara had always deferred to Lila, but tonight, her expression was unreadable. They sat in the living room, the evening stretching out before them. The tension in the air was palpable. Clara had been quiet all day, more so than usual, and Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. As they prepared to leave, Lila finally broke the silence. "You've been distant," Lila said, her voice sharp, cutting through the quiet room. "What's going on with you? Why haven't you been yourself?" Clara looked up slowly, meeting Lila's gaze with an intensity that made Lila's stomach twist. She could see the shift in her sister. This wasn't the same Clara who had always followed her lead. Clara was changing. And that scared Lila more than she was willing to admit. "I'm fine," Clara replied, her voice steady, but there was something in her eyes that made Lila's skin crawl. "It's just. I've been thinking. About Ethan. About everything." Lila felt a surge of unease. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You know the rules. This is just a game." We both agreed. Clara stood up, her movements deliberate, measured. "I'm tired of being the second choice, Lila. I'm tired of always being in your shadow." Lila's breath hitched. The words hit her like a slap to the face, but the pain was nothing compared to the fear that followed. Clara wasn't talking about the game anymore. She wasn't talking about Ethan. She was talking about something deeper, something that went back years. Clara's words cut through the facade that Lila had so carefully built. "This was never just a game for you, was it?" Clara continued, her voice softening, but there was a firmness in it now, something Lila had never seen before. "You've always been in control. Always. But not anymore. You're not the only one who wants something real." Lila froze. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. Clara wasn't just talking about Ethan. She was talking about the one thing Lila had always feared, losing control. The game they had played, the secret they had shared, had been built on deception. But now, it was breaking them apart. Clara wasn't going to let this continue. And neither was Lila. In that moment, everything changed. The carefully crafted illusion they had been maintaining shattered. The competition between them, once subtle, now laid bare, raw and exposed. "I won't let you take him from me," Lila said, her voice shaking with a mixture of rage and desperation. It wasn't just about Ethan anymore. It was about losing everything she had fought for, her place in the world, her sense of control, and most of all, her sister's loyalty. Clara didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped closer to Lila, her expression unreadable. "You've already lost," Clara whispered. "I'm not the same person anymore. And I'm not afraid of you." The words cut deeper than anything Lila could have imagined. Clara had broken free of the chains that had bound her, the chains that Lila had unknowingly placed around her. And now, Clara was no longer just the quiet, passive sister. She was standing up for herself, for the first time in her life. Lila felt her chest tighten, her thoughts spiraling out of control. The world around her seemed to tilt. For the first time, she wasn't in charge. For the first time, Clara wasn't the passive participant in their twisted game. And Lila wasn't sure how to handle it. That night, everything they had built came crashing down. As Lila watched Clara walk out the door, her footsteps heavy and deliberate, a single thought consumed her: this was no longer just a game. This was war. But the battle wasn't just for Ethan's heart. It was for something far deeper, far more dangerous. It was for control. And now, Lila had no idea how far she was willing to go to win it back. The next few days after that fateful night were a blur for Lila. The words Clara had spoken echoed in her mind, relentlessly, haunting her. "I'm not the same person anymore." For the first time, Lila was unsure of herself. She had always prided herself on being in control, always knowing how to manipulate every situation to her advantage. But Clara was slipping through her fingers, and Lila could no longer ignore the growing sense of panic that gripped her chest. Everything she had worked for, every carefully crafted illusion of control, was unraveling. The game they had played for so long was no longer fun, it had turned into something far more dangerous. What had started as a harmless competition for Ethan's affection had become an all-consuming rivalry, and neither sister seemed willing to back down. Lila knew she had to act quickly. Ethan had become the center of her world, and losing him to Clara was simply not an option. The thought of Clara, the quieter, more introspective sister, winning Ethan's heart was more than Lila could bear. Ethan had always been hers. It was supposed to be her who captivated him, her who held his attention, and now it seemed like Clara was on the verge of taking it all. Lila couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not after everything. It was a warm evening, just before dusk, when she made the decision. The air was thick with the scent of summer, but Lila was cold, an ice-cold rage had settled in her heart. She had always been the stronger one, the more assertive, the one who took what she wanted. And now, she would take Ethan for herself. There would be no sharing. Clara had to be removed from the equation. The plan formed quickly in her mind. Clara had always been so trusting, so easily manipulated by Lila's charm. She knew Clara would never suspect her of anything more than the typical sisterly protectiveness. But tonight, it would be different. Tonight, Lila would make sure Clara couldn't take Ethan from her. The thought of losing him, the only person who had made her feel seen, truly seen, was unbearable. Lila had spent hours preparing. She had already picked out the perfect dress, the one that would catch Ethan's eye once more, reminding him of everything that made her irresistible. As she slipped into the dress, she felt a surge of adrenaline coursing through her veins. This was it. The end of the game. Clara wouldn't win. Not this time. She glanced over at her sister, who was sitting quietly on the couch, lost in her sketchbook, oblivious to the storm that was about to hit. Lila's heart tightened, but she pushed the feeling away. Clara had to be dealt with. It was for the best. After all, Clara had never understood how important this was. How important Ethan was. This was the only way to make sure everything stayed in its rightful place. Lila, Clara said, looking up from her sketchbook, sensing the change in the air. Are you okay? Lila didn't answer right away. Instead, she gave Clara a smile, one that seemed almost too sweet, too practiced. I'm fine, she said, her voice smoother than it had been in days. I just thought we could have a drink. To celebrate, you know? Our little game. Clara frowned, suspicion flickering in her eyes. A drink? I thought you said we were going out to see Ethan. We will, Lila replied quickly, her tone a bit too sharp. But before that, just one drink. To loosen up, right? Clara nodded slowly, still wary but trusting her sister's intentions. Lila poured 2 glasses of wine, making sure to slip a small vial of sedative into Clara's glass when she wasn't looking. It was a calculated move, one that Clara would never suspect. Lila had always been good at hiding her true intentions behind a mask of sweetness and care. The wine was smooth, almost too smooth. Clara took a sip, savoring the quiet buzz of the alcohol as it began to relax her. Lila watched her, her eyes cold and calculating. This was it. Once Clara was out of the way, there would be nothing left to stop her. Within minutes, Clara's movements began to slow, her eyelids heavy. The drug was taking effect. She swayed slightly on the couch, trying to fight it, but it was no use. Lila stood up and moved toward her sister, feigning concern as she placed a hand on Clara's shoulder. Clara, you're tired, Lila said softly, her voice honeyed with false sympathy. Why don't you rest? You've been working so hard lately. Let me take care of everything. Clara nodded weakly, the drug pulling her into a haze. I'm fine. She muttered, her voice slurring. Lila smiled, a dark, satisfied smile that only she could see. Just close your eyes for a moment, okay? She helped Clara lay back on the couch, her sister's body limp and unresisting. But as Lila looked down at Clara, something flickered in her chest, a brief, irrational hesitation. The memories of their childhood, the bond they shared, flooded her mind. For a fleeting moment, Lila almost regretted what she was about to do. But then she thought of Ethan, how much she needed him, how much he meant to her. The hesitation passed as quickly as it had come. Lila stood up and grabbed her purse, her mind already racing ahead. She needed to act fast. She would take Clara to the outskirts of Briarwood, to the old Caldwell quarry, where they had once played as children. It was the perfect spot. No one would ever know. No one would ever question it. And when Lila returned, she would be free to claim Ethan once and for all. As she carried Clara to the car, her mind raced. She was close, so close, to getting everything she wanted. Ethan would be hers. And Clara, the one who had always been the quiet one, the one who had been so easily overlooked, would be nothing more than a shadow in her rearview mirror. Lila's grip tightened on Clara's body, her pulse quickening with every step. This was the end. There was no turning back now. The night air was heavy as Lila drove Clara's unconscious body to the outskirts of Briarwood, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Every breath she took felt jagged, every movement deliberate, yet within her, a wave of unease swirled. This was it, Clara was out of the picture. The final obstacle to her happiness had been removed. But deep down, there was a gnawing sensation in the pit of her stomach that she couldn't ignore. For the first time, Lila questioned whether she was doing the right thing. The Caldwell quarry loomed ahead, bathed in the silvery glow of the moon. It was an eerie place, an abandoned site, forgotten by the town but never truly abandoned by its haunting memories. Lila had played there with Clara when they were children, a time when things were simpler, when they weren't fighting for control. But those days were long gone. Now, it was a place for something darker, something final. Lila parked the car near the edge of the quarry, her breath shallow as she turned off the engine. The sound of the wheels crunching against the gravel echoed in the stillness of the night. She sat there for a moment, staring at Clara's lifeless form in the passenger seat. The drug had taken effect quickly. Clara's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, but she was out cold, completely unaware of the fate Lila had prepared for her. Lila's heart was hammering in her chest as she stepped out of the car. She moved quickly, efficiently, opening the passenger door and dragging Clara's body from the seat. There was no time for hesitation. The plan had been set in motion, and Lila wasn't about to let anything stand in her way. As she struggled to carry Clara's limp form to the edge of the quarry, memories of their childhood flooded her mind. She remembered Clara's soft laugh, her shy smile, the way Clara had always looked up to her, always followed her lead. That bond, the one they had shared, seemed like a distant memory now, something fragile and broken, lost in the shadows of jealousy and competition. Clara's weight was a burden, heavier than Lila had expected. She fought to keep herself composed, but the anxiety clawing at her insides was almost unbearable. As she reached the edge of the quarry, she paused, looking down at the dark, murky water below. It would be so easy. One quick push, and Clara would be gone. No one would ever know the truth. The perfect crime. But then, Clara stirred. Lila froze, her heart racing as Clara's eyes fluttered open, groggy and confused. Her lips parted as she tried to speak, but the words came out in a slurred whisper. Lila. What are you doing? Lila's breath caught in her throat. She hadn't planned for this. Clara's groggy gaze fixed on her, but there was no fear, no anger, just confusion. For a brief moment, Lila saw her sister as she used to be, fragile, vulnerable, the girl who had always relied on her. But the reality of what she was doing hit her like a ton of bricks. Clara was awake. And Lila couldn't let her go back. Not now. In a burst of panic, Lila shoved Clara forward, sending her tumbling over the edge of the quarry. The sound of Clara's body crashing into the water below was deafening, echoing through the still night. Lila stood there, breathing heavily, staring at the spot where her sister had fallen. The world seemed to stop for a moment. Time stretched and bent as Lila stood motionless, her heart pounding in her chest, the silence deafening in her ears. What had she done? For a moment, there was nothing. No sound, no movement. Just the quiet, oppressive weight of her actions. Lila felt a cold rush of dread wash over her. She had pushed Clara. She had taken the one person who had ever truly been her family and tossed her away like she was nothing. And yet, as the adrenaline of the moment wore off, a part of Lila felt a sickening sense of relief. Clara was gone. Ethan would be hers. She could finally have everything she had ever wanted. No more competition. No more fear of being overshadowed. The jealousy, the anger, it would all be gone. But that relief was short-lived. The weight of her actions began to sink in. She had crossed a line from which there was no return. Her mind raced as she turned back toward the car, her hands shaking as she fumbled for her phone. It was time to put the final part of her plan into motion. Lila texted Ethan, a carefully crafted message that would set everything in motion. Clara's not feeling well, Ethan. She had a bad migraine, and she asked me to cancel our date tonight. I'm really sorry. Her fingers trembled as she sent the message. The lie felt bitter in her mouth, but it was necessary. Clara's disappearance had to look natural, nothing out of the ordinary. Lila knew it would be weeks, maybe months, before anyone started asking real questions. As she drove back to Briarwood, the weight of what she had done pressed down on her chest. The town would believe her. Ethan would believe her. They would never know what truly happened, would never suspect that the person Lila had once loved the most, the one person who had shared her life since birth, was now gone, buried in the depths of the quarry. But as she turned the corner into Briarwood, a feeling of dread washed over her. Something wasn't right. The knot in her stomach tightened. Her actions had set in motion a chain of events, but she hadn't considered the consequences, hadn't thought about what would happen when the truth began to unravel. As Lila parked the car in the driveway, she looked out into the quiet night, a chill creeping up her spine. The game was over, but the real battle was just beginning. The quiet of the night was almost suffocating as Lila sat in the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel with a death-like grip. She had done it. Clara was gone. The life they had shared, the bond that had once been so strong, had crumbled with a single, deliberate action. She tried to steady her breathing, but it felt impossible. There was no going back now. The weight of her decision pressed heavily on her chest. At first, there had been relief, a rush of adrenaline as she pushed Clara into the quarry, knowing that she had eliminated the only real threat to her happiness. But now, as she pulled into the driveway of the family home, a different kind of dread began to settle in. Lila couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She had carefully orchestrated the story. Clara had gone missing, she was the distraught sister reporting her disappearance. But it wasn't enough. Something inside her churned, a gnawing sense that the truth would catch up to her sooner than she expected. The lie she had built, so carefully and precisely, was fragile. A single crack, a single question from the wrong person, and it could all fall apart. As she stepped out of the car, her eyes caught the light flickering in the window of the living room. Ethan's car was parked outside. Lila froze. For a moment, time seemed to slow. She didn't know what he was doing here, what he expected. The lies she had told, the manipulations she had carefully crafted, what if Ethan knew something? What if he had figured it out? She pushed the thought aside, forcing a calm expression as she walked toward the front door. Her heart was beating erratically in her chest, but she didn't let it show. She couldn't. Not now. Ethan was standing in the doorway when she entered, a look of concern etched across his face. "Lila," he said softly, his voice laced with confusion. "Where's Clara? She didn't show up." I tried calling her, but she never answered." "I thought you said she was just feeling sick." Lila swallowed hard, forcing a smile. "She's fine," she said, but the words tasted like ash. "She's just resting at home. You know how she is. She can be a little moody sometimes. But I'm here now." Ethan didn't seem convinced. His eyes narrowed slightly, the skepticism in them growing. "Lila, this isn't like Clara. She would have called me. She wouldn't just disappear like this. Are you sure she's okay?" Lila's stomach twisted, the facade she had carefully constructed starting to crumble under the weight of his gaze. She opened her mouth to speak but found herself speechless. The lies that had come so easily before now felt hollow, insincere. "I'll go check on her," Ethan said, his tone firm, determined. I need to know she's okay. You're not telling me everything." A wave of panic washed over Lila. She couldn't let him go to the quarry, couldn't let him uncover the truth. She took a step forward, blocking his path. "Ethan, please," she said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to stay composed. "Just trust me. Clara's fine. She's probably just embarrassed. You know how she is." But Ethan wasn't buying it. His expression hardened, the doubt in his eyes turning to something sharper, something colder. "I don't believe you, Lila," he said, his voice now firm with resolve. "I'm going to find her. I'm not going to let you cover this up." The air in the room grew thick with tension as Ethan turned away and walked toward the door. Lila watched in silence, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't let him go. If Ethan found Clara's body, everything would be exposed. She would lose everything. She had to stop him. In a desperate panic, Lila's mind raced, the fear of being caught consuming her thoughts. As Ethan opened the door to leave, Lila's gaze fell upon the kitchen counter, where a glass of water sat. The glass was half full, its surface reflecting the dim light. Without thinking, Lila grabbed the glass, the cold liquid sloshing inside. She approached Ethan from behind, her hand trembling as she reached for the glass. In one swift motion, she swung the glass, sending the water splashing against his face. "Ethan," she cried, her voice loud, frantic. "Please, just stop. I can't do this anymore." Ethan recoiled in shock, his eyes wide as the water dripped down his face. "Lila, what are you?" "I did it for us, Ethan," she shouted, her voice cracking under the pressure of her emotions. "I did it because I love you. I wanted us to be happy, to be together. But you'll never understand. You'll never understand how much I needed you. How much I couldn't stand the thought of losing you." Ethan stood there in stunned silence, his eyes flicking between Lila and the shattered remains of her carefully constructed world. The truth was out, and there was no hiding from it anymore. Lila's breath came in ragged gasps as the reality of what she had done crashed down upon her. She had killed her sister, her only family, and for what? To win Ethan's love? To satisfy her own insecurities and desires? In the end, she had only destroyed everything she had once held dear. The sirens could be heard in the distance, growing louder, as if they were the very sound of Lila's downfall. Ethan's face twisted in disbelief, his gaze hardening as the truth sank in. The game was over. And there was no escaping the consequences of her actions. Lila's life, once perfect and controlled, had shattered beyond repair. What do you think of this story? Do you think Lila's desperation is understandable, or did she go too far? How far would you go for love? Leave a comment below and let us know your thoughts.